What if society collapsed tomorrow? Would you be able to survive? This is a question I am fascinated by and honestly have been fascinated with since I was a child. I think because I read a lot of dystopian fiction. Now, although I am not the doomsday prepper I once thought I would become as a child, I am still fascinated with how authors write the end of days, and more importantly, how does their protagonist survive? In my opinion, Octavia E. Butler has the most realistic description of total societal collapse, and I am currently rereading her duology to create a silly little survival guide. But first, welcome to my reading corner, where everyone is welcome. Today we are talking about an Earthseed survival guide based on the famous Parable of the Sower by Octavia E. Butler. Now, let's start with a little context. This book was written in 1993 and takes place in America in 2020. Our protagonist, Lauren, is pretty much facing the end of society in America due to extreme climate change, food and housing insecurity, and an ineffective government. Now, I read this book about 4 years ago and I never read the second book. I recently saw a TikTok that really said, hey, people think the first book is crazy. Read the second book. It is very descriptive of America today. So maybe she's a prophet, I don't know. But I decided I wanted to go back and reread both of them. Now, I highly recommend this book to all, but I do want to add a trigger warning to this book and this video that if topics like societal collapse, the world ending, sexual assault, death, and starvation impact you severely, this is likely not the book or video for you. Although I want to keep this video light and funny, I have to admit that this is a hard read, especially reading this in 2025. Now, for those of you who are watching this video and never intend to read the book, I am going to give one important plot point, and it is about our protagonist, Lauren. Lauren is a girl, a very young girl who is wise beyond her years and lives in relative sanctuary in her neighborhood, while there is complete chaos outside of her neighborhood. They have formed a very strong knit community, really led by her father, who is a pastor in this community, and they believe that they can remain untouched from the chaos outside of their walls by working together and helping each other, which is true to some extent. However, Lauren, as a young girl, realizes that there is no way that they are going to be untouched by everything outside of their safe sanctuary. And unfortunately, one day, the worst happens and her home is decimated, burned to a crisp, her family members gone, her community members gone. It is truly horrific. But an important thing to note is that Lauren always knew this day would come. She was very prepared for it and had already thought about what she was going to do if the worst happened. And so this is one of the biggest plot points in the book that drives the book for the rest of it, is that she has to leave the sanctuary where she was just planning for what would happen to eventually being in a scenario where her and just two other neighbors that she's able to link up with have to transverse north with hopes to find a better place to live. So this book really focuses on Lauren learning the new world and what it looks like outside of the sanctuary she used to live in and how to roll with the changes she has to experience. So I developed this survival guide based off of things that Lauren learned throughout her journey. So let's dive into that. The first is to build a community, not just stockpiles. In the book, no one survives alone. Trust, alliances, and shared knowledge matter more than any supplies. This is what kept Lauren's family safe before their home was burned down. They were a very close-knit community. Her father, they never directly say this, but my sense is that he was prepared for the societal collapse, ensuring that everyone had the weapons they need, that they had an abundance of seeds, that they had abundance of knowledge of what to do. It seems like he had a lot of books on plants and maps on how to go places. Like, he had more than I think the average person would have. Having a community is what really kept them safe. If one person's house was impacted, everyone else was rushing to help them. They had a community school. When it came to food, they would share as much as they could. So it was really about what is the community you have versus the things that you have that got her through hard times. before her house burned down and after, honestly. That being said, one of my takeaways is that you should know your neighbors, understand your community, understand mutual aid. There's actually a book I really want to read, I'm going to put it here, about mutual aids and how it builds your community and helps it thrive. But yes, know people and know that you can rely on them. And honestly, I know that sounds really hard. I like barely know my neighbors, but hey, I'm starting to say hello more. I'm starting to like converse a little more. So the second biggest takeaway is kind of relating to Lauren's philosophy that God is change. One theme in this book is that Lauren basically starts to create her own ideology based on the thought that God is change. I found a website. I think someone like actually created a religion based off of Lauren's religion in the book. That was really an interesting breakdown. To share something that is on this website, feel free to go to it and poke around. It's called godischange.org. The first tenet of Earthseed is Lauren's religion that she creates, is that God is change. Lauren knew that the key to survival was adapting to the changes instead of dwelling on the past. She starts writing about her ideology, which she calls Earthseed, and roots it in the idea that times are tough and will likely get tougher, but those that survive will have the opportunity to create something better and stronger. So getting through the tough times is all anyone can do. Now, although this point is linked with her ideology, I don't know if I believe in that ideology. I do feel like her point that you need to be adaptable to change in a time like this is so paramount. Yes, you are not going to have the comforts of your home. Anything can change at any given moment, and being able to roll with those punches and not dwell on what you used to have is so important. So, in conclusion, with that point, learn how to roll with the punches. Now, the third takeaway I had was that you do need to have some basic preparedness. I think this really followed like the Maslow hierarchy of needs of you need food, water, and safety. Those are the three things you need to survive at a minimum. Now, for example, when she was living in her neighborhood, they could rely on acorns, fruit trees, and gardens to feed them. A neighbor even had rabbits that they used to breed to create meat. And when Lauren was forced to leave, she also had enough money to buy food throughout her journey to fuel her. So food was paramount to survival. And even more important than that was water. Water was also super scarce in this time, and our protagonist throughout the story used water purification tablets to clean possibly contaminated water. There was also a really interesting chapter where she had this knowledge. Like I said, knowledge is very important. That if you dug a hole deep enough near the ocean, some of the seawater would come up and be filtered. And so she tries this in one of the chapters and finds it to be maybe not the cleanest water, but brackish. And that if you took that water and added a purification tablet, you could potentially rely on seawater as a water source. If there's any water experts out there, let me know. If you have any tips, hey, put them in the comments. But yes, water and food are super paramount and probably the basis of your need. And then the third is your safety. They had a lot of guns in this book. I think her father was a little bit more prepared than the average person. And even at some point, he's like, look, if you go out of our little community without something to protect yourself, you're pretty much gone. So have something versus nothing. And I'll be honest, I have a lot of political thoughts about gun and gun ownership, but this is just what's in the survival guide. And you know what? When things were really bad, it was usually a weapon that kept them safe. So take that for what it is. Now, I think there is also a need for skills. Skills are what really help you grow a community, whether that is being able to grow, being able to hunt, just knowing basic medicine, just knowing like basic safety procedures is super important in these times. One thing that she had that I'm kind of gonna take away for sure is that she collected seeds so that if she had to leave and start a new community somewhere else, she at least had some seeds to provide food for herself. But like I said, not everybody has a green thumb. I always joke with my friends that like if we bought a compound, they each need to bring some skill to the party. Mine would be gardening. I'm good at gardening and I'm good at like cooking and baking and stuff. I have a friend who's an accountant. I have a friend who's in law. I have a friend who's really like handy, like she can sew anything and woodwork anything. A friend that's a really good mechanic. Like you need skills, you need hard skills in these times. Now, the last point that I took away from this book was to have a philosophy. In my opinion, Earthseed was not just a belief, it was guidance in the chaos. Lauren kind of used it as a form of code of conduct of how she would handle scenarios. So you see her be very consistent in her decision making throughout the story because she had a very strong code of conduct, which led into her having very strong morals of what she thought was and was not right in any given scenario. I think when there is no government to like tell people what is right or wrong, when religion is like not there to help people guide their morals, like unfortunately we would just see the worst of people, and all we could do as an individual is hold ourselves to a certain standard when everything is in chaos. That's kind of scary. Well, that concludes today's video. Thank you for joining me in my small corner of the world. As I said before, I will update this video once I have read the second book, so know that there will be a second one coming later in the year. I am going to try to start posting every Thursday, so we'll see how consistent I am with that, but I'm going to give it a good old try. And thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe. And please let me know if you have any really key survival skills. I am definitely like, my dream is to have acres, chickens. You know the meme? Like, we're gonna have chickens and acres and be like, maybe not 100% self-sustainable, but the thought of having a lot of land and being somewhat self-sufficient is something I am very fascinated with. But if you have any tips or tricks that you learned from any other books, I would love to hear them. Please drop the book in the comment and tell me what you learned from your favorite dystopian or utopian novel on survival. But until next time, thank you for joining me in my small corner of the world. Bye.